Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Daniel Suarez. Daniel is an award-winning New York Times best-selling author, speaker, and former senior systems and analyst to Fortune 1000 companies. His breakthrough book was in 2006 with Demon, a book that anticipated the rise of AI power, social media manipulation, cryptocurrencies, augmented reality, and autonomous vehicles. He has since written 7 techno thrillers and science fiction novels on topics ranging from cyber war, autonomous robotic weapons, human agency, genetic editing, and private space exploration. With space, the focus of his 2 most recent books, Delta V and Critical Mass. Daniel, welcome to the Future Space.
Oh, Daniel, thanks for having me.
Now, are you going to tell us that the future is doom and gloom and Terminator is going to rise with AI taking over?
Well, not to sound pat, but it's what we make of it. I think early in my career, I was writing more cautionary tales. I wouldn't say that that was a deliberate thing. I was trying to point out some concerns, sort of exploring the near future. And one of the good things about the Delta V trilogy I'm working on now, as I'm dealing with space, is it is a more optimistic story, I'd say a hopeful story, but not by force of will. It's based on the research that I've done that I think that we have a number of terrific options for solving a lot of our problems, for working together to solve them across borders and cultures. And there's a lot of upside too. So it's a very positive story. Even if you're a straight up business person who's mostly focused on the bottom line, there's some positives. If you're an environmentalist, there's positives. There's reasons for us to work together, basically. And so not doom and gloom, although a huge set of challenges, but I think it's those challenges that will bring us closer together, forge greater bonds, and set the course for a better future, basically. So I'm quite hopeful.
I hear a lot of wisdom in that third book. Before we get, I have many questions for you, Daniel. But before we get there, I always start, my interviews with the same questions. Can you give us, for you, what are 3 words that capture the essence of space?
So when you first asked me that question, I thought, well, okay, that's easy. And then I wound up spending, quite a bit of time thinking about it, because that's sort of how poetry works, right? Is you have to distill it down to this essential meaning of what so much concerns you. And I thought long and hard about space to boil it down to 3 words. And I finally came up with our inevitable future. And by that, I simply mean that it is ultimately what we're going to have to grapple with to have a limitless future, a future that's bright and full of possibilities. We're going to have to go beyond Earth eventually. And so it's ultimately the thing that is what space is to me. And when we talk a bit about the story of space, I could further expand on that and how those 3 words fit into it.
Well, that's the segue really to the next question is beyond the science story, beyond the technology story, beyond the politics of space. What is the human story that connects, also to these 3 words? What is the human story of going to space?
And that's really where, when I say our inevitable future, what I mean. If I think back to everything I'd read about history, archaeological evidence, ancient astronomy setups from Stonehenge and onwards, tracking the stars and the movements of the planets, space has occupied the human psyche ever since prehistory. We gathered around the fires and we pointed at the stars and we invented constellations and mythologies around them, and those became narratives that unified tribes and then regions. And even back then, even back before agriculture, people noticed that there were certain stars, quote unquote, that moved against the background of the firmament, and those were the planets. And those gave rise to a whole bunch of other narratives and mythologies, gods and so forth. And so from our very beginning, perhaps even before we were fully human, space figured prominently in us, and it figured prominently in our transition to an agrarian society, because of course you'd have the shaman and the high priests and priestesses who could find the patterns and wait for the signs that it's time to plant. It's the right time of year. It's the solstice. It's the equinox. They'd find these patterns. And that led to slowly unraveling questions about our world and how it ran, to anticipate things, to model things. Portents like comets. Space has always had an outsized impact on human events and our impression of both ourselves, our place in the universe. And so as we go step by step learning and predicting things, for example, predicting when a planet might rise, like understanding the physics of the world, Isaac Newton and all that, anticipating eclipses, these were positive signs that we were on to understanding the world, and it gave us confidence. And so space has been incredibly important for us, I think, from the very, very, very beginning. And now, of course, we're reaching orbit and reaching space. And that's really where, to me, perhaps you'll resonate with this, because I know you were a solo adventure traveler. I'm trying to remember the gene. It's DRD47R, which is known as the wanderlust gene. That there has always been a certain small population, a very small population among humanity, that valued novel experiences among anything. And they are always the explorers, the ones who push back, go beyond what is known. And so I think these are the people among us who are going to take that narrative we have for space and take it to the next level, to go deep out in space beyond what we know and have experienced before. And these are the people who charted the oceans, who blazed trails all throughout history. And of course, now the Earth is mapped and known. And I like to think that a lot of the people who are base jumping and wingsuit diving and going deep sea diving, cave exploring, these people are sort of the frustrated explorers. They might have been the Magellans of their day, and now they're doing that perhaps on Instagram. But space, I think, will change that. It will provide them the frontier that I think will bring them to life again, and they will go and extend human experience deep out into space and really find what we're made of, what we're capable of. So that is the human story of space to me. It is a integral to the entire human story, and has always been there, an ever-present background to our story. And it's also what drives us forward. It's what focuses us. And I think the adventurers among us, the explorers, are the vanguard of that. So that's how I would describe the human story of space.
It's always a little bit complex when it comes to the well, we talk about the exploration gene, right? Because there's the law of conservation of energy in nature and life, where usually it will take the easiest path between 2 points because it wants to conserve energy. But then you have these individuals or these organisms that once in a while they go off the beaten path, and then they really forge. They spend more energy trying to find new places, and those are the ones who will take life.
It's incredibly selfless. Really,
exactly,
if you think about it.
And I find
they're extending the ecosystem, the biosphere, the possibilities for everyone to their detriment. So in many ways, it's a very giving thing to do.
Yes, a very giving. The often I think we talk about how it's a human story, the going exploration. But I think that what we've done as a species is that we've created a story on a force that we found in life in general. Right? Life is constantly looking to adapt and to expand and then to reach new frontiers, but we're putting it into like a storybook and about us. But we're not doing anything different than nature does. We're just kind of engineering its way forward. And now the next step is quite of a dramatic. It's a big step, right? I think that we can compare it to coming out of the ocean or coming down from the trees. It is that type of evolution leap, where the energy and the technologies that are needed for that next one, then actually will just create a new entire understanding of the human experience, because now it is. And I know that it's hard for people to understand and to grasp because now we're talking about a planet, but it's nothing different than everything else before, right? It's nothing, you're talking about how we've always looked at space and trying to see ourselves in it or used it to understand our world today. This is what we do for with our worlds, and then we evolve with it. I was looking over the weekend the series Shogun on Hulu. I'm not going to reveal anything, but there was in that time there's some scenes where you could see that if there was an earthquake, they would associate the earthquake to whatever was happening in that day, and it would either be a good omen or a bad omen, and then everything would be define.
That's right. Some still do that,
and they still do that. And space has often been about like we got to make a decision when we see the comet or whatever.
Yeah.
And so
it's obviously a new king will arrive
coming down from the sky,
and the universe is like whatever.
It's interesting because we are insignificant in the big scheme of the universe and of life, but at the same time we are the only species that we know of that in 3.6 billion years will do something that we don't know if it's ever been done before, which is about to take life and give it its continuity beyond, right? What would be the point of growing in complexity for 3.6 billion years only to be limited on this tiny speck and then, disappear after a couple billion, another billion because the sun has grown bigger? We're giving it. There's no one else, no other species that is going to offer that.
We know of.
So
yeah, that self-awareness helps because again, that's part of the narrative, right? You have to be self-aware to perceive narrative and then to want to change that narrative to be able to see into the future. And of course, there are some species who scientists have shown evidence that they think or envision a future. Corvids is one, ravens among others, that they can problem solve and imagine the future. But of course, that to me is our great superpower, the ability to imagine complex future realities. And then the steps to try to reach there. And that's what excites me so much about space. You mentioned it in relation to the movement of creatures from the oceans to the land. And I think that's not a accident that Carl Sagan described space as the edge of the cosmic ocean. Because it is that big a change, us moving out there, but it's also as vital. Because, of course, if we hadn't moved out of the oceans, we wouldn't have had mastery of fire and so many other technologies. So it's the needed change we need. The other thing is, and I relate this back to the books that I'm writing, which is there's an urgency to it. And again, it brings us back to climate change, our conflicts here on Earth over resources, space, who gets what. Especially as climate changes and the existing growing patterns for agriculture and so forth, drought, all of these things, we have invested so much over so much time in terms of infrastructure that when the status quo changes suddenly, it really can spark conflict. And this is why there's an urgency underlying our efforts to establish industry in deep space, to try to grow the economy without damaging the Earth, to provide economic opportunity for people around the world and energy where it's needed without harming the biosphere more. These are all really urgent questions. They're not just idle curiosity, but I do think it is the explorers who will have the courage to go out and try to do these things early. They'll be absolutely pivotal. And so that's why I think there was always an evolutionary purpose for people these explorers who don't seem to have an evolutionary purpose. It's to try to shake things up and expand the possibilities. And I think it's quite beautiful. And I wonder, other species must have this as well. There must be adventurous ravens and antelope, who go off and look for new grazing grounds. But that is essentially what we're talking about here. We need to really encourage the people who do this and then connect them with the people who can envision the technology and then the investors who can help make that happen. And we've seen this before in the age of exploration. Fortunately, this time around, I don't believe there will be indigenous people being colonized as a result. But, the deep space and asteroids, planets, all of these things, it's going to be a tremendous adventure, but I think it can redound to the benefit of Earth. which is really what I think the urgency is.
When you talked about the antelope or the animals, I did some years ago. I was kayaking around Kodiak Island, and I kayaked to a smaller island, and I landed and I set up my camp, and then and then once everything was set up, this brown bear came out of the grass and saw me, and then turned around and then disappeared.
Now, hang on. I have to interrupt you for a second. You said Kodiak Island, right?
Yes.
So when you say brown bear, this is a Kodiak bear, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's a very large bear.
So the bear shows up, and then he sees me, and then he disappears. And then over to the horizon, I saw two deer that were there. And the thought that I had at that moment was, in that small island, I'm pretty sure there were others, but there were 4 individuals that at some point had left the beach behind and swam, and we all found ourselves into this place and really kind of like connected on this, like we were all of the same kind of motion, and not motion, but this energy of leaving something and then finding ourselves into a new destination.
The mainland. You left the mainland and you went out to the island.
Daniel, do you think that unfortunately nature has created this reality that to adapt and create the incentive for evolution, unfortunately running your environment to a brink of stress and breaking is part of that process? That if there was not this place that you get to and where you're forced to adapt, evolution would have kind of stalled, billions of years ago. That now, you look at Europe back in the 1500s, 1600s, it was an absolute disaster. It was a mess. So much that
beginnings of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. So do you think that unfortunately that is something that will never disappear because it's ingrained into the process of evolution?
Well, the fact that you and I are discussing it is an improvement. In other words, I don't think many other species in the past have had the opportunity to say, this seems to keep happening, And we have, for better or worse, the ability to change our environment, as we've seen. And I say for better or worse because at times, some people can say, well, there are more trees in North America than there were back in the 1800s because we don't burn trees constantly for firewood. But, it's not all a good thing. If we can start to reason things out and see a way to stop these, what I guess evolutionary biologists would call punctuated equilibrium, these spurts of mutations that are caused very often by changing circumstances. And of course, this gets back to what we're saying. Life is constantly changing and evolving to adapt to new circumstances. And very often those new circumstances are caused by the prevailing food sources, the predator and prey relationships, the environmental situation. I'm thinking, once again, the Industrial Revolution. I believe there was a moth that evolved to get grayer because coal dust was being put. And when we say evolved, it's simply natural selection. The grayer moths survived because the birds didn't see them against the trees and so on. So we see this constant change, and that constant change is it comforting in a way because it means that what we're going through is nothing new. As you've mentioned, I'm trying to remember the name, the Permian extinction. It's like 90% of all living things on Earth went extinct. So nothing new under the sun. The Earth will be fine. It will continue. Our goal is, of course, to try to make sure that we're fine. We'd like to bring the entire biosphere with us and to preserve it, to be able stewards of the environment. I think that's the evolving nature of us now. If we play our cards right and start to become more self-aware of where we want to be and how to get there and how to sustain. Sustainability is something that is being talked about constantly now. And I don't think that was the case. You go back a century ago. There was the perception that there was always another horizon, another continent, another island, some new domain that we could engage in. Now, it is true that space is that. In Gerard K. O'Neill's book, The High Frontier, he was postulating about growth and having a dynamic civilization, how different that is from a static civilization. And I think that's one of the benefits of obtaining new resources and energy, is it allows human beings to try to self-actualize and to do the things they imagine instead of trying to maintain this razor's edge in this closed system, which I think we are getting more and more toward here on Earth. I mean, having outstripped the ability of the Earth to provide for us on an annual basis, it's doing more and more damage to the biosphere. And by expanding into space, we can relieve that tension. And to go back to Gerard K. O'Neill, in The High Frontier, he postulated, and I believe I have this right, that at a very torrid rate of growth, like among the highest rate of economic growth and economic development in human history, we could do that for 12,000 years out in the solar system. Now, you don't want to imagine the entire solar system covered in neon signs and looking like Vegas. I don't think that's what he was contemplating. But the idea of enabling us to buy time to evolve, to become more aware and more refined in how we are stewards of our biosphere. I think that's what going into space would provide. It would provide us the growth to be able to deliver economic opportunity to billions of people on Earth while not further damaging the Earth. And in doing that, in addressing that problem, it would enable us to work across borders to see, to really understand that, first of all, the overview effect. We're all alone out here. It's us. It's just us. And so I think we'll have more love for our fellow persons. But the other thing is working across those borders and seeing all the vast resources and energy out in the universe that we don't need to squabble over every last scrap. That's the number one thing. If I were to have one bone to pick with a lot of sci-fi, and again, I love sci-fi, and a lot of what I would criticize I'd still enjoy, but it's a very common trope to see a sort of neo-feudalism in space, where people are squabbling with fingerless gloves in dark, dingy areas, huge space stations that are somehow dripping water and leaking everywhere. It's a very common thing. It looks cool, but I really wonder if that's necessary. Because, I mean, we're talking vast amounts of energy, vast amounts of resources, and the freedom to pursue these things and to seek association with like-minded individuals, plenty of space. That seems to me a more hopeful situation. I think it'll be a frontier that is a little more bright than that. And unless, sure, the early going will be stark, but I think once we get our sea legs, to use that term, I think it will be far more inviting and more people will come along.
That's one thing that I've always struggled about, these vision of the future. I think that even the science fiction, we've been extremely simple in projecting what's coming. We're extremely linear, right? We'll write about the future and then we'll see a technology, and that technology has evolved, but nothing else around, right? You look at Star Wars, and they have the technology to navigate, speed of light and everything, but everything else is extremely archaic, and the society has not evolved, and their spaceship is just like a clunker mess of metal. Or that Star Trek, you have all this where everybody can self-express themselves, but they all wear one spandex uniform, and like it's
the exigencies of wardrobe with the studio is really what it is. This is the budget you have for wardrobe.
But I think that we've created such a negative narrative about the human species that we forget what we're great at. I mean, a lot of people, a couple of days ago, I was having a conversation, and we're bringing nature into the conversation in space, and someone said, we're the worst of nature. Well, I'm like, if we want to say we're the worst, then we all have to say that we're the best of nature, right? We're the ones who bring a certain sense of moral, because nature is not fun. Like, if you really want to go out and spend time in nature, you're going to see it doesn't care whatsoever if you live, if you die, if it breaks, if it doesn't break, and all this. So we amplify the good and the bad, but what we do best is we figure things out. But life is messy by design, and the reason why we're 8 billion on the planet is not because we're bad, it's because we are pretty good at finding solutions when that incentive is there. And like you said, I think that like going into like I cannot dissociate our capacity to be better with the increase of technology. The technology increases, but at the same time, so is our motivation to manage those. And one of the often when people say it's like everything is moving faster, yes, that's true, but also our potential to manage the like when you're a baby, the only thing that you can kind of crawl your way to is like a little hill. Now, once you get to that hill, if you fall off, it's not dangerous. You're kind of rolling off and everybody's laughing. As you get older and older, you're climbing up higher mountains and higher mountains. And yes, you get to that point in life where you're climbing up Everest, where one misstep could kill you. But also your skills have evolved with you so that as the danger increases, so is your capacity to manage it. And I think that this is the thing that we forget about us, is that we're not, you were just saying earlier, we're not a static species. We're extremely dynamic. We're constantly bouncing off and adapting. And we have this agency and this power where we're resilient, and this is what we do. So is your new book, and I think that is your wisdom that you were saying at the beginning, because now more and more you've realized that as this dynamic world around us is forcing us to kind of rise and figure a way forward, you've come to see the bad, but also the good, how we
Well,
work.
yeah, it's a catalyst,
Yeah.
right? This is part of the reason why I called the fictional company in these books Catalyst. It's because, again, it's something that sparks a rapid reaction, a change. And that's the thing that really occupied me. To go into the reasons why I wanted to write the Delta V series, and of course, it's Delta V Critical Mass so far, and then the third book, titled To Be Determined. It was because I'd written a number of books, at that point, 5 books on technology and its effects, its second and third order effects on society, and all of the things you discussed, narrow AI and genetic editing and drone war, all of these things. And for better or worse, I anticipated the outcomes of some of those things. And I've evolved somewhat myself on the value of cautionary tales, because people can read them, but I don't think it ultimately changes the outcome. And drones are probably a good use. If you take a look at Isaac Asimov and the 3 rules of robotics, that a robot should not hurt people. Like, we have been saying this for 70 years, and then the minute a drone, it was possible to have a robot cheaply harm people, I swear to God, it was like an hour later, it's like, ta-da! So we in the main, we have, let's say, these impulses that large groups of people do, whether or not individuals think it's a good idea or not. And yet, we are the same species that can create the James Webb Telescope and share information. The other thing is the communities we build, we can say that, people are selfish or people are cruel. And yet, again, the vast majority of our infrastructure is social. We want to be together. People extend kindness and mercy to each other constantly. We're not a uniquely bad species at all. I think there's some intensely beautiful things about humanity, our ability to appreciate other creatures, and our role in, like I said, being stewards of it. I think we are increasingly aware of that. So there's hope for us yet. And I think that's one of the things that space does provide. And so the catalyst for me wanting to write this trilogy of books was having written all of these other books that were more cautionary tales about technology. There'd always been a question that I wanted to answer, and that was, I love sci-fi and read tons of hard sci-fi from the 70s and 80s all through my teenage years. And I wanted to be able to answer the question, how do we get to some of those really cool and positive sci-fi futures, not with just assuming we're going to reach there, but literally from where we're standing here in the present, step by step, what is one way we could do that? And it turned out to be a harder question to answer because than I thought. I live right near JPL. I'm friends with JPL scientists and people at Caltech. Fortunately, my books have availed me, given access to experts that I would not otherwise have access to. And asking all of these questions of people, you get very different answers. And I spent a total of about 8 years doing research for the first books to really understand what that narrative might be. And I completely changed my own view about it. Initially, I guess I was wondering whether or not it would be a positive story. And now, having done all that research, I'm emphatic that it can be, and is, a really positive story. That we are at a crossroads, we're at an inflection point where we could actually be the really great generation that unlocks a livable future for countless generations that come after us. And I suppose that's always the question, right? But if we do this right, it will make representative government, livable future available to everyone by demonstrating it, not by forcing things on people, but by providing energy and resources to people straight around the world. It'd be a very beautiful thing to do. And that actually gets me excited. And it's quite the opposite of sort of the drumbeat of doom that is present everywhere around us. And that's being perhaps unfair because, of course, we have very serious issues facing us with both climate change and rapidly expanding technology, what it's going to do to the social contract, increasing conflict, all of these things. And I think to some degree, they are always present in the background and they motivate us as a society, and we react to each other and we react to the reaction of others and so on. It's this very iterative process. But I seriously felt that with these books, we could go step by step. We just need a small number of people to really try to test the waters, the first adventurers who go prove that it can be done. And then it will start to rapidly accelerate. So I'm a firm believer in it now, that space is very integral to our future. It's also urgent and urgently important. And it's an act of just humanity, to be kind to the rest of humanity, to try to achieve this. And I think there's a great many people who feel that it's a waste of resources, that we're instead somehow distracting from problems here on Earth. But I would say that we can best solve these problems. And of course, we don't want just 1 or 2 billionaires doing it. We want us to be doing it. We want people around the world. So we need to create new structures, new economic structures, perhaps new social structures. And of course, that's not unlike the age of exploration, when the Europeans first explored with the spaceships of the day, those great sailing ships, and went around the world. It won't be pretty at times, but it's a process.
That's what these new frontiers have always offered. I mean, America was the land of new opportunity, and it was founded on people that were frustrated of Europe and how stagnant it was, and it's been elevating and driving a vision of the world ever since. It was not a clean process. I mean, the beginning, they had to fight their way, and we had.
Then there was slavery,
both in
and
South civil wars,
but in the South of the United States, yeah.
And it was these things that have always been present in the history of humanity, but now in this new land of opportunity, some people decide to be different, and that's one of the reasons it's always hard to go and say we're going to go into some other countries and then have them be like us, but not going through all that growing pain of choosing how you want that society. But you look at, I always try to bring back these complex ideas to something that is always like simpler to process, and the family is often the place where people can all connect, right? If you had all your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-great-great-children all live into this confined little house over, conflict will obviously rise, and then it's going to be, and all these, yes, everybody is the same family, but a lot of personalities, a lot of conflicts, a lot of issues. Everybody at some...
But you have empathy for each other, right?
You have empathy, yeah. And then, but everybody at some point leaves the family house, the home, and they all go and create their own lives. And they're not doing it at the expense of the parents. They're actually doing it in support of the parents. And then ultimately, these generations of families create a wealth that, can now is powerful. It can move through times, and this is some of the things that we've observed in America with the lack of generational wealth, that haven't been able, and that's the one of the gaps. So as we go to space, when we go to these new places, it is never at the expense of what is behind. It's actually, it offers this opportunity to create more and elevates everything else. And the technologies that are created to reach those new destinations become part of the solutions. And it's when people say, oh, the amount of money that we invest in space, I recently posted, well, if you compare that to the industries of sport and entertainment, which does absolutely nothing other than entertain us, right? This is nothing and bring us together. But, the trillions of dollars that go into nothing really to solve the climate change or to solve anything other than entertaining us. So space is a fraction. And for the billionaires, the reality is the billionaires have always been part of that process, just because they're the ones who can fund for reasons that are more personal. Back in the days, and if we go back to Europe, it was the kings that,
Queen Isabella.
Exactly. They're the ones who were financing, the aristocrats that were financing because they could, or it was the church. The church for a long time was the one financing a lot of things, whether it was through power, or you go back into the Renaissance, the Medicis, who were funding, Leonardo da Vinci's and all these great architects. The thing that I do give the Medicis is that they had the vision to include art in creating that vision, right? If so many don't have the money but don't have the vision, and the Medicis had this vision of creating a vision of the world, and by bringing these architects and these painters and these sculptors and funding, being their patrons, and which led to the Renaissance. But I think that one of my biggest worry in terms of going to space is the politics of it, the divisions, some of the divisions they're going to be creating, because now you have more space, but also more opportunity to create your own community that is not connected with the rest. And you're going to have resources at the same time. They're going to create, that bring challenges. We see the Chinese, wanting to be the first one on the moon. They're building their space station. So it's going to be really important that the conversation, the diplomacy of the United Nations, or the Artemis Accord, or all these, the work that is being done on Earth, really has to be a foundation as we move out. Is that part of what you're writing about also?
This is why I was squirming, because it is very much what the third book is about. It's like how we fashion these new social arrangements. What are the propelling influences in it? And to be deliberately vague, but also to give you some sample of what it is, I would say right now, in some ways, authoritarianism is on the move. It has been, when we built the global economy, I think, from speaking to a lot of investors and others over the years, many of them had the idea that by folding China into the WTO, Germany engaging with Russia to buy natural gas and other resources to power that by having that engagement, we would influence them to become more democratic and open and rule of law based. And I don't think that panned out the way they wanted. I think the problem with authoritarian systems is that no one else is in charge. You've got a very small group of people, or one person in charge, and then you're subject to the vagaries of their personality, their dysfunctions, or for lack of a better word, their personality, as opposed to a democracy or a representative government, which is not supremely efficient. It's not super efficient, but it sands off the worst edges, the sharpest edges, the extremes. And so things go slower, but they're more informed. And ultimately, it can be like sausage making. But what did Winston Churchill said? That democracy is the worst form of government other than all the other forms that we've come upon. And So it's not perfect, but it's the best thing we have. And when it comes to space, again, it's people having the freedom to pursue things, to freely associate with one another. That is the superpower of freedom, of democracy, of representative government, is the assumption that the individual, their voice and how they pursue happiness themselves, to, within reason, so that they don't destroy the happiness of others. I guess the old phrase is that my freedom ends with my hand at the tip of your nose. In other words, I can't swing my hands around and hit everybody. But the point being that free people don't expect permission or instructions. They find their own meaning. They pursue their own friendships. And that, I think, is, if we let it, the possibilities for space and for free society in space. And why I think that it's more likely that freedom and representative government, rule of law, transparency, these things will evolve in space over authoritarianism. Some people would say that authoritarian nations can decree that they're going to spend X amount of money and go into space. And we certainly have seen China, and I should make it clear, when I say China, I mean the CCP. I don't mean the Chinese people, because I think there's a lot of evidence that the Chinese people very much want to be free. I think they've enjoyed their engaging with the world and traveling with the world. I don't think they view the rest of the world hating them. I think that they like being part of the community of nations. And I think that's good that they've had that firsthand experience. Because as we go out into the world, I think a lot of those people, particularly if they're entrepreneurial, may start to question whether or not they need a distant authoritarian telling them what to do. And especially if you're out there with a bunch of other free people creating new industries and drastic growth and all these opportunities, I think it could turn into a golden age if we do it right. If we try to lay down a foundation, once again, of transparency, rule of law, I think that's the key thing, is that people understand that there is some agreed upon law and that we all have a seat at the table to talk about that. And it should be predicated upon human rights. When you were speaking about these groups cloistering, walling off from one another in, let's say, their own O'Neill cylinder or some type of station, that is no doubt true. But the other great thing that I learned in all my research is that when it comes to cislunar space, especially in like geo orbit, it is fairly easy to move, let's say, from L5 to L1 or L5. It's a very low energy expenditure, in particular if we have lots of energy and resources. And I'd like to think in that future that part of the human rights, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights in Space, would be a couple of things. One would be the right to freely associate, the right to leave a space station you do not want to be part of, that you have the right to leave. If we do that, I think that solves a lot of problems. One other thing going into the future, I think, would be a right of return to Earth, at least to visit. If we have 1 trillion people, that's going to be tricky. But once in your life, if you were born in space, the right to go back to the cradle, so to speak, and to see it and to experience it would be great. But that's part of it, that new social contract that I was contemplating, which is that as we go into space, we're going to have to create a new social contract, and we want to have lots of people have a seat at that table.
It's I wrote many years ago there was a question: are you a cheetah or a lion? And I was looking at the species of the Great Plains of Africa, and you look at the strategy of survival between the cheetahs and the lion. Right, the cheetahs are expert at one thing. Everything has been built for speed, but they're extremely fragile on everything else. Right, if one piece of that puzzle starts to break, then the entire puzzle starts to fall apart. The lions are not great at anything. They're good at everything. They're generalists, and they work in community for to achieve, and that's why they are the dominant species, the king of the jungle. Is they're not that expert, but they're the ones who can kind of work together and figure things out. And for me, the U.S., I'm Canadian. I've lived most of my life in the U.S. I'm the Canadian who actually prefers living in the U.S. And people are always like, "You're must be bizarre. You should stay in Canada." But for me, for me, the US embodies really the best and the worst that what we can do. It's a very dynamic ecosystem. You can find the best and you can find the worst. When it works, it's a moonshot. There are no other places in the world that can accomplish what it can when it puts it, itself to it. When it doesn't, it's a shit show. But that's for me, that's nature, that's life. It's messy, and every 30, 40 years, plus or minus, it goes through this profound transformation that all the things that it fought for are now taken for granted, and they're about to be abused and lose. And this is what we're going through right now, right? All these things that every civilizations. But so far, every time that it has gone through these transformations, it manages to come out better than what it came in. And until it proves me wrong, that's what I will believe. If you're able to keep your eye on the long perspective and not be, bogged down by the day-to-day, the messiness of it, that there's a beauty to it that for me reminds me of nature and life in general. So it's going to be really interesting. Daniel, I want to be mindful of your time. Of all your interviews and your research of basically the human story, right? Your books, they are about being humans and about getting through the ups and downs and the process of transformation and learning, and how do we manage the technologies around us, and how do we start on one point and continue. What would be kind of these three words of wisdom that would kind of capture the essence of all the learning that you've discovered?
Yeah, I've thought about this quite a bit as well. And in this case, I wouldn't do it as a 3-word phrase, because when it comes to what I would term my own personal wisdom, it's these sort of atoms, these I guess single ideas that have proven helpful to me over time. And not all of my life have I followed these, but I found them to be useful. I think one of the first things is meaning, that what you do have deep meaning to you, that what you pursue. And again, that can be, as people go through life and they might be dealing with a mundane job that they find stressful and annoying, but they do it for their family, they do it for their loved ones. That's meaning. And that goes into the second word, which would be belonging, being part of a community. So having meaningful work that you're pursuing and belonging to a community. And I would finish it by saying measured. That is, when news comes in, good or bad, over time I've found that it's not typically as bad or as good as it first appears. That total disaster can actually somehow open opportunities. And sometimes things that seem like unalloyed goods, you may be surprised that there's some downsides to it. So over time, I've acquired what I like to think is the wisdom to be a little more measured in how I deal with the ups and downs of life. So those would be my three terms, 3 words of wisdom.
I think that on your last word, I think that is one topic that our society struggles right now, because
yes,
we have lost.
That's the understatement of the year.
We have become so spoiled that we have forgotten our capacity to be resilient, and I think that we try to outsource the resiliency to technology, and then we are afraid of the uncertainty of the future, because it's all these stories that we put ourselves, and because social media is overwhelming us with all these scenarios and everybody has their own theories.
Yeah. Well, outrage gets clicks. This is what research shows. And so if you can outrage people, you'll engage them longer and they'll see more ads. It's like the lamest dystopia ever. If you look at it that way, it's like, wow, it's ads. I think it's the clicks and the views. And we'll grow past it, I think. But boy, it's going to be some growing pains in there.
And we do better when we're in those situations. We don't do great anticipating them, and with the concept of it, because I think that then we go into all these different stories and we forget really what brings us together. But when when the shit hits the fan, when the problem starts to show up, we also show up, the majority, right? I'm not saying that it's
Daniel, you're
I'm not
absolutely
saying that
right.
it's like, oh, it's paradise and everybody walks hand in hands and sing kumbaya. That's not.
Well, let me. Does this sound true to you? You travel quite a bit. You see people from all around the world. It's been my experience that when I meet people who might not on paper be people I would get along with, that the extreme, polarization in our society would seem to indicate that they're my mortal enemy. Very often, when you meet people in person, they're far more complex than that, and you can get along much better. You can find things in common, and if you are both or all of you dealing with an urgent, a pressing situation, something that's important, people can absolutely put these things aside and pitch in and be part of community to solve problems. So really, social media is it's a simulacrum, it's a pale image of reality, of all the complexity of what we are. I think that's its biggest drawback. So whenever I go see people in person, I come away much more hopeful about us. And this is particularly true when I meet young people. When I do these reader meetups and I meet my readers, I find out how wonderful they are. They all come from different areas of life, but there's a certain conscientiousness about it. But also young people, they are trying to make sense of a world that is rapidly changing, changing so much so that I think a lot of older people really can't grasp the implications of it either. So I think there's some element of them being lost at sea. But again, I think they will find their way and chart the course to a really interesting future. And they certainly have an understanding, a native understanding of technology to do that. And I think we'll see what they do with it. It should be quite interesting.
It will be for sure. And that is precisely in all my expeditions, the thing that brought me the biggest rewards when people ask me, oh, your favorite places, mountains. You can't find mountains in many places. You can find, nature in many places. But really, the most cherished memories that I have are with people. And part of my creative process in all these expeditions was to plan half of it and not plan the other half, because I would
That's why
I would go to these places because I've always thought that it would be arrogant of me pretending that I can go and be a visitor and capture the spirit, the essence of these places that I've never been, right? So I would stay with a family, I would stay with people, and it's through their eyes, sitting at the table, breaking bread, sharing a glass of wine, and what you discover is that all over the place, independently of our opinions, of our visions, of political ideas and all this, we're all the same people. We all want to be valued. We all want to do some
in the ways that matter.
And then we all want to put food on the table. And then after that, it gets messy, right? We want to offer our kids.
Yeah.
So when you travel and you go, we're gonna go down to Antarctica with William Shatner and Scott Kelly and Neil deGrasse. Here you have this ship of people that can afford it, but come from all over the world. And if everybody came in on the ship with like a giant sign announcing their opinions and everything, like it would be divisive, right? But that's not what.
It's social media,
and that's not what happens. What happens is that for 10 days, for 2 weeks, you're on this pressure cooker, this floating pressure cooker.
That's right.
And somehow.
And an algorithm, if it chose who spoke to who, this is essentially what we're doing.
So no, I'm not naive. I don't think that you and I and the others were naive and blindingly optimistic about the future. I think that we actually give more credit to who we are as a society than getting into the doom and gloom wagon of thinking that we're the worst thing that was invented on the nature. So,
which I absolutely don't think we are. We're not the worst thing or the worst creature that's ever existed. That's ridiculous.
That was fun. Thank you so very much.
It was likewise, Daniel. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Your book is coming out.
Yeah, that TBD. When I finish it. Because this is the thing about my books. I do a deep dive. I do a lot of research, and then I start writing, and then typically about halfway through, knowing what I know, then go back and do a little more research. So
Maybe you need
I
a
will I will announce it everywhere the moment I know.
maybe you need a bigger incentive to finish it. And so
Hell, I have plenty. Thank you.
it was a pleasure, Daniel, and I'll put all the
Always a pleasure,
information
Dan.
for people to reach you. And until we see each other, take good care.
All right, thank you.